Scattered across the eastern approaches of Bass Strait, in the direct path of the roaring Forties, lie the rugged and picturesque islands of the Furneaux, Kent and Hogan groups of islands. These islands are among the wildest, most remote places in all of Australia. They are sometimes called the Forgotten Islands, or Australia's last frontier. Aboriginal people walked across this land bridge when seas were lower during the last ice age to settle these islands and Tasmania, though they were gone from the island by 4,000 years ago. A few of their descendants returned during the early 1800s, pressed into service as slaves and wives of the unruly sealers who settled these bleak outposts, far from civilization and the law. They and their descendants became known as the Straitsmen. They subsisted on what they could grow and catch. For well over 100 years, the principal income of the Straitsmen was from the sale of mutton birds, their oil and feathers. Hundreds of thousands of fledgling chicks were caught before they left their burrows in late March and April, plucked, salted in barrels, and exported to Tasmania. The Straitsmen commuted between the islands and the mutton bird rookeries in small open boats, 20 to 30 feet in length. These boats were built by the islanders themselves and were expertly handled. In the early days, they would make these voyages in these small boats to Launceston and the Victorian coast to sell their annual harvest. As small as these boats were, they were the first island traders. The smaller islands of the Furneaux group were taken up earlier than the main island because they were only lightly wooded and no fencing was required.
If they wanted to run sheep on Flinders Island, they'd have to put a boundary fence up, and fencing material was expensive and hard to get. On an island, the boundary's already there, and they just clean up the island and run their sheep. And it's a good life. We enjoy something like that even today. You sort of feel relaxed and free when you step out of the aeroplane or off the boat and on the island. You're, to a degree, king of all you look at. And it's nice. Go on, get over there!
Alf Stackhouse, initially with his brother Brian, had been the lessee of Badger Island for 60 years. At the age of 86, he's considering giving it up. He says this year's shearing will be the last. Then there will be the final muster to remove the stock. Alf's younger brother Brian, aged only 84, has leased Hogan Island for a similar period. With the help of Brian's son Richard, they are completing a landing barge, a kind of ark, to remove the stock from the islands. It's a vessel that would have been of great benefit to them 60 years ago. But this will be their last muster. These islands will revert to the wild, and another colourful chapter in Australian history will come to an end.
Then you can load all the yards individually.
Badger Island was occupied for 90 years by successive generations of the Beaton family. The old detached kitchen of the present homestead is believed to have been the original home of Isabella Beaton.
That old tank has been here all the time we've been here, and it's off a wrecked ship. And this door off the... I imagine this door here is off the HJH. It's a cabin door that they salvaged when the boat got wrecked here years ago. Oh, nice to be here again. Yeah, this old building, we use it for a cookhouse, but it was, when we first came here, it was used as cookhouse accommodation. It was 2 rooms. It was built in 1800 and something, before the house next door, I'd say. It's got round timber, local grown round timber in the structure, and it's still serving the purpose for which it was built. We use it for cookhouse and dining room.
The Bass Strait Islands are renowned for the prevalence of snakes.
There are snakes on Badger. but you don't see them very often. Before we lined the kitchen, you see, there was an odd hole in the ceiling, and one of my young daughters was in here one day and the table was there with nothing on the table. We just arrived actually, and next thing a snake falls down through the hole onto the table and slithers outside, and there was a great fuss over that, and that's one of the reasons why the kitchen got relined.
There are 42 islands in the Furneaux group. About half were settled in the 19th century. Sustained by the soil and the sea, some islanders were content to spend their entire lives there. Over time, some families have moved to the main island, Flinders. Left to the ravages of wind and weather, some of the old island homes have fared badly. The isolation of island life may have been daunting for some, but others, like Frances Rhodes, embraced the freedom and independence. She enjoyed a happy childhood on Prime Seal Island.
I don't know, I just remember mostly the freedom we had. My mother didn't like doing housework, and she had a dairy, and she milked so many cows, made the butter, shipped it to Launceston and sold under Prime Seal Island dairy butter, and employed someone to look after the house.
Island people were resourceful and self-reliant by necessity.
We had our own vegetables and all that sort of stuff, and our own meat and our own eggs and our own milk and our own butter. It was really mostly tea, sugar, flour, dried fruits, raisins that we got, and you get them in bulk. But I can never really remember being without anything.
Alf and Brian Stackhouse were given the opportunity to take over the lease of Badger Island in 1952. However, as they didn't have the money to pay the outgoing lessee, an old friend, George Bligh, a prominent island grazier for whom the brothers had worked, offered to loan them the money.
"Oh, would you, George?" we said. "Yes, I'll lend you £2,000. Pay me back as quickly as you can. Now, I don't want you to tell anybody. This is between me and you." So, and until he died, I never told anybody this story. But I think he deserves to be known for what he did do, good things nowadays. And of course that was in 1952. Well, if you know about the rural industry, you know wool went up to £1 a pound, which in 1952 was a lot of money. And we had that much money, we didn't know what to do with it. And we paid George back and went ahead like anything. That was really good.
Without a jetty on the island, everything had to be brought ashore in the time-honoured method, by dinghy and by hand.
This gulchway was used in the early days when people came here in bigger boats, and they'd use the dinghy to bring the gear up. And as you can see, you can unload here in any tide. You've always got a clear pathway compared to the rocks anywhere nearby. We used it when we first came here too. It was when we first came here, we'd have other people's boats in 1952, and they'd land us and we'd carry stuff up onto the bank, and then we'd get the horse and sledge and get it. Groceries and wool packs and all those sort of things, small stuff. What you can handle, 2 men can carry, it would be the maximum load.
Sheep were taken off the island the same way.
So you'd get a sheep, pick him up, carry him on your shoulder, and you'd have those 2 hands that have his after legs would be here, and his head would be over your shoulder, and you'd be carrying there, and balance him on your shoulder, and then you walk out to the boat. You'd have your sea gum boots on, thigh boots, because you'd walk out to the side of the boat, and you'd drop your sheep off your shoulder. You just tip him off your shoulder, you see. And whoever was in the boat, I'd be in the boat, or another hand, we'd grab the sheep and stand him up on his behind, you see. So you pack them all in with all their heads, you know.
In the dinghy, they'd mostly sit them up, sit one on top of the next one, or sit the next one on top of the last one, like in sitting on a motorbike. You know how the pillion rider sits behind the driver. Well, they sit the sheep up like that so they can't shift, and that's how they would transport them. And then they get it to the alongside the ship, and two men would then get hold of the sheep, one at each end, and lift the sheep up onto the deck, and they'd be stored in pens on the boat. Hard work.
And then Kangaroo Island, I went over there and I nearly had a fight on my hands over there. Could be a mate. he had to keep the gang going. That old Charlie Harley, he was branding the sheep, you see, with this brand, and this wet brand. And they were all black round the ear hole down. And they had the turners with me, the turners from Launceston. And Blinky'd say, "God, I'm bloody black," he said. Hey. Carrying the sheep, and the old Charlie Harley branding the sheep before he sent them away.
Running stock on the outer islands presents its own unique set of challenges.
Too many people have got too much input. When we first went to Badger, we did as we knew had to be done, when we knew it had to be done, because it had to be done, and we did it. Nowadays, you can't light a fire without permission, you can't shoot kangaroos without permission. In fact, you can't do anything without permission from somebody or others, meaning one or a dozen people in departments in the city who dictate to you what you can do and can't do. And it doesn't work. Bureaucrats really don't know what's happening in the bush, and they shouldn't interfere with it.
Small ships were the lifeblood of the islands, bringing all the necessities of life and taking away wool, livestock, dairy products and mutton birds. The numerous rocks, shoals and reefs, combined with strong currents and frequent gales, made navigation of the Furneaux group extremely hazardous, especially when sail was their only power. Shipwreck was an occupational hazard. Ships and shipping companies came and went, and the list is too long and tedious to document here. Suffice it to say that the Hollyman family of Launceston were involved in the trade over a very long period. They operated a host of sailing craft in the island trade, as well as small steamships such as the Tambar, Collarboy and Narrabeen. Captain Will Nichols and his capable wife Amelia, who were based in Stanley, entered the island trade in the 1920s in competition with the Hollymans. Firstly, with the ketch Lady Jean.
Bill Nichols in the Lady Jean was the first one, in 1928 I think. Around there, Dad gave him his first load of cargo, and that got him a start here because Hollymans were the other boat, and it was someone going in opposition to Hollymans. And Mrs. Nichols, she was a dear old lady. She'd sit us kids up on the bulkhead or somewhere on the boat and dig in our feet for splinters, box thorns. We'd never feel the box thorns, their skin was too tough. But she'd give us an orange because, you know, she'd be prying these splinters out of our feet.
The Nichols replaced the Lady Jean in 1936 with a larger motor vessel, Lady Flinders, built at Ned Jack's boatyard in Launceston. After operating her for 2 years, they sold her to their former competitor, the Hollymans. Unfortunately, she was lost on Three Hummock Island soon after. Hollymans carried on trade with the Loatta, which was another Ned Jack creation. Both the Loatta and the Tasmanian Transport Commission Narra Cooper used the southern port of Lady Baron, which was unsatisfactory for those producers in the north. With the shipping service to Whitemark and Emitter withdrawn, Frank Jackson with farming interests in the north, took matters into his own hands and had the auxiliary ketch Shearwater built to service these ports and the outer islands.
He got most of his finance from George Bligh and others up north. George Bligh was the principal backer, and he built the boat down here. Wilson Brothers built the boat in Cygnet, and it duly started trading.
Bill Barrett was appointed the Shearwater's first master, while Frank Jackson's son Les gained his sea time to sit for his skipper's ticket. Having spent his childhood on prime Seal Island, Les had developed a keen interest in ships from an early age.
I can still see it, sat there with the big windows that opened onto the sea, and the boat was coming past. There was one mast, there was two masts, three masts, 4 masts, and he was gone. And that was the Commandy. The Almadopal was the one with 3 masts, where we'd seen that one before. I think she was a timber trader between Hobart and South Australia, I think. And 3 masts, well, it was unusual. But when there was 4 masts, he couldn't contain himself.
Les Jackson's exploits have been well documented and photographed in Patsy Adam Smith's book, There Was a Ship. Patsy sailed several voyages in Shearwater, photographing the loading of cattle and sheep, the transport of mutton birders to Babel Island, and the loading of casks of salted mutton birds, including this photo of the Shearwater loading barrels of birds in the Big Gulch at Babel Island, where no vessel of her size had been before. Jacksons added the vessels Margaret, Thwaites and Prion to their fleet in the early 1950s, only to sell out to other island interests in 1956. The Shearwater was unfortunately lost on 9th Island in 1962, but fortunately without loss of life. Other vessels involved in the trade of the 1950s and 60s were the Leprina, Lee Derry and Flinders Trader, all island-owned, as well as the government-run vessels John Franklin, Narracoopa, Sumatra and Joseph Banks. The Lady Gillian entered the trade in 1969 and was to remain the longest of them all. A young Luke Toonan joined her as a deckhand in 1972.
So we were just carrying general cargo, be a weekly run out of Launceston to Whitemark mainly, of all the general stores for Flinders Island. And you know, there was it's an amazing mix of cargo that we carried, you know, and that just anything really that went to the islands. That was the stable mode of transport for the islands, and it was a real mix of cargo that we carried. And we carried a lot of livestock back. It was all the livestock from Flinders was shipped out live. So we carried sheep and cattle and horses and whatever, and lots of them, yeah, regularly. So it was always a bit of a mix, you know. You'd be cleaning out the hold from the remains of the cattle trip one morning, and you'd be loading food on top of that about an hour later, you know, and trying to put a few tarps down to make sure it was dry and clean. I mean, I don't think it would pass quarantine today. It was a very hands-on thing, you know. They used to just, the boxes of groceries used to come down on trays. There was no palletising in those days. It was all stowed by hand, and we'd have a gang of men down below and just stow it by hand and pack it in as quickly as best we could, you know. And yeah, that usually took a couple of hours to get all the general cargo, the food stores in for the supermarket, etc. Boxes and whatnot, you know. Now and then there'd be a few breakages, of course. Yeah, the odd pilfering by the odd thirsty crew member from the brewery products, but but that didn't happen very often, I don't think.
Lady Gillian also made regular trips to Port Welshpool in Victoria with livestock and wool. On this occasion, filmed by the Lady Gillian skipper Ian McFarlane, she backloaded a stock trailer for Whitemark. At Whitemark and Lady Barron, stock could be walked aboard with little effort. But at the outer islands, without jetties, loading cattle was always a challenge. Brian and Alf Stackhouse had done it all their lives, but for younger men, it was an exciting change from the normal beer and grocery run.
Something to look forward to for our crew. It was something different, and it was interesting. Prime Seal Island, owned by Rue and Chesty Bly at that stage, they had cattle out there. They used to just see to them every now and then. They were very wild cattle usually, and they'd go over a couple of days before we were due, and depending on the weather and coordination with the company to try and get them there. The company was always a bit reluctant to send them there because I don't think it was very profitable, but it was all part of the service. And they get the cattle in, or try to get the cattle in, usually have a bit of a struggle. The yards were usually fairly superficial, often made out of driftwood off the beach, etc. And anyway, we'd turn up and they'd hopefully have the cattle in the yard, and then we'd anchor in as close as we could to the yards, directly off the yards, and then we have a very long, what we call the bull rope, very long rope, about inch, pretty solid rope.
And we'd have the cattle in the yard, and you'd run, pick them out what you wanted to ship, and run two down the race, which faced onto the beach, the top of the beach, and you'd corral two of them at one time and head rope them, and lead that rope under the race with a peg in it to stop the cattle shagging. And that was tied onto what you would know as a bowline in the bight of the bull rope. And when all was ready, the shore party would signal to the boat crew to take up on the winch, and the race would lift up and let the cattle underneath it, and they would go down the beach.
And they'd have someone holding back with the Samson post on the beach, and then you just keep the rope tight and sort of slowly heave it out. We usually they were usually just hand signals. And then you'd pull two cattle at a time and down the beach, and they would often struggle very greatly, and sometimes they'd break free or something.
And when they were in the swimming mode, the workboat would come in and come alongside them and undo them off the bull rope, hook one each side of the workboat, motor out to the trading vessel, and from there they were swum into a cage.
Earlier on they used slings. They used to try and get slings right around the cattle. Very hard to do.
A steel crate was eventually introduced as a more humane and quicker method of loading cattle.
The crate had a gate each end, so you just lower that into the hull and let them out, whichever way they were facing, and repeat the process.
It'd take you 8 hours probably to load 50, 60 cattle if things went well, but it could take longer if it didn't. It was usually pretty full. You'd start, daylight, and you'd be a pretty full day to fill the hold if it was a good load. I specifically remember one occasion getting cattle in at Prime Seal Island, and Rue and Chesty and their gang ashore had a lot of trouble getting them in the yard, and we were getting a bit impatient. And one of the crew, Tony Pickett, better known as Sprocket, who had a soft spot for the bottle of blue. By 10 o'clock or so, he was pretty primed up, and he said, "Oh, I'll rouse them up." We were getting a bit impatient, and he went up and blew the hooter on the wheelhouse, and they just got the cattle in the yard, and off they shot over the rails and out into the paddock again, and so we lost a few more hours while they had to go and rouse them up and get them back in. They had a couple of old horses over there at those stages and used to use that, motorbikes. And so. Yep, that was one event where it didn't quite go to plan. The Lady Gillian we used to get, or in the trailer, you get about 10 cattle to a pen. We used to have 10 pens down below with gates, and you had to be very quick getting the gate shut sometimes, particularly with the island cattle, because they were often, the Hogan Island ones particularly, were very large cattle. You often, normal runs with cattle, we'd get 10, 11 cattle in a pen. You go to Hogan's, if you're lucky to get 6, 7 or 8, and that would fill it up. And they were particularly large and wild cattle. And yeah, no, we used to be very fearful of them, and especially the two guys down the hole, you know, locking them up, and you didn't get in their way, you can be sure of that. So
Livestock had to be shipped quickly and in relatively fine weather.
We carried stock in open hatches, and the agreement was that the masters made the decision. Everything went smooth. The company didn't. If it was bad, it was weather, and the master was doubt about carrying stock, and he gave his honest opinion. The agency or the owners, they just went along with the master, and the stock losses were negative. You know, the only cattle I've seen we had problems with that shouldn't have been shipped anyway.
a good run from White Mark to Welshpool, Victoria, or Launceston, Devonport. They were all roughly 12-hour runs, good going, which was always the aim, to only do it in reasonable weather, but that wasn't always the result. You know, you sometimes get caught out, and yeah, there were some long trips, very long trips sometimes, and a hard westerly going to Devonport. You get caught halfway, or Launceston, and you know, it might take you 16, 17 hours. And then, of course, that's when the cattle and them usually suffered more, because they were there longer, and it was very rough and wet.
There were times when the weather deteriorated, unexpectedly resulting in stock having to be discharged into yards at White Mark or Lady Barron. While the jetty at White Mark enjoyed the benefit of being centrally located, it suffered the disadvantage of requiring a high tide to enter across shallow mudflats. However, these same mudflats provided the port's only shelter from big seas. The exception to this was when a full gale coincided with a very high tide, as graphically illustrated in this photo taken by Ronald Wise of the Lady Gillian almost mounting the jetty in a nor'west gale.
We sat weatherbound in White Mark at times for weeks at a time, you know. I remember one year, I think it was around October, September, in the equinoctial gale period in early 80s. I think in 6 weeks we did one trip or something like that, you know. So there were periods where it was unsuitable, totally unsuitable for livestock, but you know, that was the staple income for the island, and we'd sit there until those cattle could get off the island.
Unavoidable weather delays caused all sorts of logistical problems for farmers and businesses.
Some of the shopkeepers, there was a lady at Lady Barron had the shop, and the boat got there on Tuesday, she was fine, but that was the way it worked, and it got Wednesday, it was weatherbound, she wasn't too good, but we didn't get there at all. It was mud, which is fair enough, and she had a business to run, and if they couldn't get there, it was only mainly always weather conditions. Very, very seldom was a breakdown.
We always made sure that our pens weren't overloaded with animals. Some of the shippers were greedy. They'd booked 30 lambs on that, and they'd put 35 in. It meant to say all the pens were full and there was so many lambs left over. There was an argument then. And I've seen them throw. As I pulled away from the wharf, I thought to myself, when I pulled away from the wharf, I told the crew to let the lines go and I'd give her a full bore. And as I pulled her away, they were throwing the lambs onto the ship. So we always had half a dozen more than we should have done. Yeah, they've been running up the wharf with the lambs shooting through. Yeah, they didn't like it. But anyway, that argument, we settled that once and for all. We told them that they would we'd only load the pens up to full capacity and no more, because the sheep would get damaged and we'd lose them, and the losses, that there was only cruel on the animals, and we weren't. That's where it stayed.
The Stackhouse brothers were born farmers' sons on Flinders Island in 1926 and 1928. Islands and boats were a part of life. When they were just small boys, Their father fashioned tin canoes for them by flattening sheets of roofing iron, bending them to shape and riveting in place a timber gunwale for stiffening around the sides.
Way back we bought a little boat about 18 feet with a deck on it and an engine in it and a suit of sails. And when we were only teenagers then, me and Brian, and we've had boats ever since.
Their experience with boats was to be an advantage when they took on Badger Island in 1952, as everything had to be brought in by sea.
When we first came here we had a small boat which we used to travel in, and this is where we used to keep her. There's a rock wall out there where that spike is in the middle of the water, and we put drilled holes in the rocks with a hammer and rock drill and cemented in steel pegs, and we had the boat tied up fore and aft on both sides with ropes and the chain to keep her safe. And you'd float in at high tide and she'd sit in the sand at low tide, and that was good. But we made that rock wall down the front by carting boulders that you could pick up, 2 men, Brian and I did it, and we carted with a horse and cart down to there, and we'd unload, then we'd go away with a horse and cart and get another load. But one night or one late afternoon, a very, very strong wind from the northeast came along, and it flipped the anchor chain off the one out to the northeast, as you can see from here, and then straight away she was only on 3 ropes instead of 4, and we had to get on board and take her away quickly before she got wrecked, which we did, and it never got wrecked. Well, we never bothered keeping a boat in here after that, because if you can't keep it there in a storm, well, there's no point in having a harbour.
Alf and Brian tried keeping the boat on a swing mooring, but she was unfortunately lost in another gale.
Because she took in water when she was moored and got washed ashore and destroyed. And that ended our boat here for a while. We used to then hire people with boats to pick us up or bring us down here. And then we got an aeroplane which made it to run the place. There was a bloke on Flinders, agent for Ansett A&A, who were operating the airline in the days, and he was a keen learner to fly, and he did try to encourage young people on Flinders to learn to fly, and I was one of them that took him up, and I went and learned to fly, and then saw the advantage of an aeroplane and with these islands, and so I bought an aeroplane, and we used that to work the island.
Alf's first plane was a Wacket trainer. Then came a 4-seater Oster, which he wrote off attempting a crosswind landing on Cape Barren Island.
The operation of landing in a crosswind has to be done very carefully, and on this occasion a gust of wind caused the aeroplane to be pointing in a different direction, not directly down the runway, and I thought I could put a bit of rudder on and point her down the runway and then pick the wing up that I knew would drop as soon as I put the rudder on, but I wasn't quick enough to pick the wing up, and the wing touched the ground, and that was the end of the aeroplane. She cartwheeled on the runway and smashed her up. And when she came to rest, I said to the bloke, "Hurry up, get out before she catches on fire." And he got out and I got out like as quick as you talk, and he disappeared. I never saw him again. He ran bush, never saw him again.
This plane was replaced by a Cessna 195 and later a Cessna 182.
With difficulty we'd cart almost anything in the aeroplane. Always I'd bring the dogs with me when I came here. They'd jump in the back, you open the door and whistle them in, and they'd pop in. When they were young dogs I'd tie them up, and when they got to be older and more sensible they didn't even get tied up. And then we'd take the back seat out and put the rams in, bring them down 3 at a time, which wasn't overloaded, and they were tied up, of course. We tied them up and brought them down, and we brought down drums of fuel, diesel and or anything that had to come down, coils of wire and wool packs and all the stuff that came in. We used the aeroplane like a farm ute, and If it wouldn't fit in the aeroplane, well then of course it went on the boat someday.
Following their success with Badger Island, Alf and Brian took over the lease of Hogan Island from George Bligh. The operation simply involved putting yearling steers ashore to let them grow and fatten on the native pastures for 2 or 3 years to be taken off later as prime bullocks. They later gained the leases of Erith and Deal Island in the Kent group. They ran cattle on Erith Island and sheep on Deal. Neither island had either fences or yards. All materials had to be freighted in, firstly in their 28-foot open boat. As the Kent group lies 30 miles northwest of the northern tip of Flinders Island, the 5-hour open boat trip across some of the most exposed waters in Bass Strait was not for the faint-hearted. But for the Stackhouse brothers, it was all in a day's work.
It used to take about 5 hours to get over from Flinders to Erith Island. You know, it was pretty good. You had to pick your weather, of course, you know, and that was good then. Yeah, when we first went there wasn't a shack or anything there. We just lived under the bush, and you got water out of the springs there that run into out at high tide mark there, and that was interesting. It took a lot of gear to build yards out there in a little boat and put it there, and then we went out and stayed there and built the cattle yards. We had a horse over there, and I fixed up a sledge for the horse pull the sledge, and on the sledge we put the posts and the wire and all the equipment, and we pulled it up along where we wanted to put the fence line, and that right over the island with a horse, and that's how we did it in the early stages.
To improve the pastures on the island, the brothers broadcast grass seed by hand.
You have a box on the front of you with a strap around your neck, and we'd start off in the morning from our camp, put a bag of seed on our shoulders, a sack bag full, not very heavy though, on our shoulders, and walk to where we knocked off last night, where the box would be sitting on the ground, and we'd tip some seed into the box and walk off in a direction, broadcasting left hand, right hand as you walked. Pick a handful of seed, one hand throwing the seed while the other hand's picking a handful, and just sort of strolling around broadcasting the seed. That was ryegrass and speargrass and melilot and cocksfoot, all those sort of seeds that were growing around on the farmland over here. It was very rich country, and it grew very well. And it's still those plants are still to be found over on the island.
Deal Island is famous for the height of its lighthouse above sea level, so high that the light was often shrouded by cloud. It was eventually replaced by 2 smaller lights erected on off-lying islands. Due to it being a light station, the island featured a jetty, which was of great benefit to the Stackhouse brothers, shipping in building materials on the traders Pryon and Shearwater. Their first shearing was carried out in the old lightkeeper's cottage, now the museum. On the outlying islands, fire was the tool of choice for stimulating pasture growth.
The only way to manage those sort of places is burning. We did dream about rotary hoeing a lot of it and getting good grass growing on it, but we never got around to that because the cost was fairly high. But burning was the best way, and of course it cleaned up tussocks as well, and the grass then came in.
It was a pretty necessary thing to burn those islands as soon as the first winter rain came, so you didn't do any damage to too much damage to the vegetation and stuff. And that worked very well to contain it, and it improved the grass area and all that sort of stuff. It did keep the the vegetation in check, shall we say, but without doing major damage to it.
Alf cleared a rough airstrip on Deal Island, where he nearly wrote himself off on at least one occasion.
We put the strip in with a rotary hoe, clearing it and rotary hoeing the tussocks and spreading seed on it. You had to pick the right weather. I nearly made a mistake once. We'd finished shearing and the shearer wanted to get home, and so we loaded the aeroplane up, and the wind was slightly southwest, gusting as it always did in that environment, and we took off downhill, of course, but downwind, and a gust seemed to catch up with us as we were taking off and sort of followed us down the strip, and we used up all the runway and then had to fly because there's nowhere else to go except into a sand dune, and the aeroplane flew, but only just. That was a very nervous period in my life. We flew out across the water at very low altitude until she picked up enough speed and then climbed away. And we lived.
The 1950s and 60s were a period of rapid expansion for the Stackhouse brothers. During this period, Brian and Alf both married women from old established island families. Brian in 1957 to Miriam Bligh, and Alf in 1960 to Alma Mansell. Both women were to give staunch support to their restless husbands. Alma was later awarded an Order of Australia for her work in Aboriginal affairs. Soon after marrying, Alf and Alma moved to a farm at Killiecrankie on the northwest coast of Flinders Island. The house was ideally situated, overlooking Killiecrankie Bay, with Mount Killiecrankie beyond. Here, the brothers invested in 4 cray boats, ranging in size from 28 to 46 feet, which were leased out to local fishermen. The crayfish were, and still are, kept alive in semi-submerged wooden coffs, which still dot the shoreline today. Being on site allowed Alf to keep an eye on the business and carry out any mechanical repairs when required. From fishing, they branched out into land development, and for some years owned the only bulldozer on the island. This gave them access to shire contracts as well as developing land for other farmers, which in turn provided cash flow for developing their own. While the use of aircraft revolutionised island access, there was no substitute for boats and ships in the movement of general cargo and livestock. The advantages of having a jetty at your island were enormous.
In about 1953, when we decided to build a jetty here, we cut the timber and everything, local timber on Flinders Island, on our own farm actually, and got Wallaby Jackson, Les Jackson, captain of the Shearwater, to bring the timber down for us. And he was a very clever skipper, and he put the boat alongside a big rock where we were going to build a jetty. He put an anchor out away from the shore to the stern, and an anchor out away from the shore at the bow, and then he put a line ashore at the bow and a line ashore at the stern so that he could lie parallel to the big rock. And then he unloaded with the ship's derrick, he unloaded the logs, and we would pull them ashore as he picked them up and hung them over the side of the boat. We would pull them ashore on the landing rock, and that's how it was done. And it came lunchtime, and we were pretty hungry and it was hard work, and we said, "Hey Les, what about stopping for lunch?" "No," Les said, "if you stop for lunch I'm going. I won't wait here while we have lunch." And so we kept on going, and we landed all the timber, and away he went. This is the jetty we built in 1953 for carting off cattle and sheep and wool. Brother Brian designed it and picked the site, and together we built it. And we had a cattle race along that side there where that wreckage is, and cattle yards in back there, and of course the wool and the sheep came down where I'm standing, and the cattle went down that race onto the boat. In those days we were running 250 cattle and 3,500 sheep on the place, and it was very, very good.
While the jetty was a great success, the ketch skippers still had to be on their mettle.
Yeah, often went into Badger to load sheep and wool, yes. Badger was a very hazardous little jetty there to get into. You'd have to have a bit of tide, and there was a couple of pebbles right underneath your keel there that you need to keep a good eye on. It was always a challenge, but yeah, I guess that was all part of the really good training to handle those vessels and get alongside those little jetties where there wasn't, they were only had a very small face on them, so you had to get square on and usually getting lines ashore onto rocks and hooks in rocks or whatever to use whatever you could to hold the vessel fast while, and to prevent the surging too much. So and then it was Badger was always something we did very quickly as we could, and got out as quickly as we could. It wasn't a place you hung around because it was fairly hazardous. But I don't remember any major incidents there. Alf was always very good, always had the wool, rolled out to the end of the wharf or the sheep penned up, ready to go. There was never any delays usually, and away you went, and that was it. You certainly didn't want to muck around there. Yeah, we used to go to Preservation, Clark Island on, particularly the trader. The Lady Gillian didn't go down there because she was a little bit deep in the trader, and so they tried to avoid her there. Plus she had a wooden bottom, which was a bit more vulnerable probably than the steel bottom of the Flinders Trader. And they had small jetties there as well, very small, in between the rocks and that, very, very, particularly Clark, that was very vulnerable. You had to go in and you had to back out. There was no way you could, drive out of there sort of thing. But yeah, it was getting lines onto rocks ashore and as quickly as possible, and hopefully they were all ready to do what we had to do, either cattle or sheep or wool, and get loaded and out of there.
Islands without jetties were difficult to work. But Outer Sister and Hogan Island were the most difficult of all.
The Outer Sisters are far more difficult to access than the Inner Sisters, given its geographical location, and it was more exposed to the weather. There's basically only one area where you could land people and stock and stuff on and off there, and that was in the House Bay there, which faced to the west. So the weather had to be pretty quiet to access that.
But the only time I went there was in the Lowatta. I was in Holloman's at the Lowatta and used to go in there. There was where you used to load. There's strong tide, very strong tides up there, and to go there on the first of the flood, the ship would do, and it'd go inside the tide race. Would go inside and there'd be smooth water in here, and we'd drop the anchor and we used to unload or load wool and everything, and then get out before the high water mark because the tide had reversed, you see. But the Sisters Island was a very high island. Bly's used to, I think we used to load about 20 or 30 bales of wool there in the wool season.
The Bass Strait Islands are famous for their snakes, and Outer Sister was no exception.
And I killed 101 in one day walking around mustering the sheep out there. The tigers and coppers, blacks and toppers, yeah. One thing I witnessed twice actually on the Outer Sisters was the sea eagles would swoop down and pick up a small wallaby, and they'd take it up to 700-800 feet, and they'd let it go and then swoop down and eat it. And I see the same thing, they'd come down and take a snake up and drop him and come down, and I could watch that any time. That was very, very interesting. Big sea eagles used to nest on the northeast cliff on the Outer Sisters, and undoubtedly they still do.
You wanted to get in as close to the beach as you could because that was less time to heave the cattle out. So, and there wasn't a lot of room in Hogan Island in the bay there, so I guess there was always anxious moments there. I had a few anxious moments there when I was a skipper there, sort of thing, thinking, are we okay? And you'd be watching the weather all the time, one eye on the weather. And I'm pretty sure that we had occasions where we had to abandon the situation and go out and anchor and wait till the weather was right till the next day or something.
In the late 1960s, Brian Stackhouse entered the mutton burn industry on Babel Island. Typical of the Stackhouse brothers' innovative and entrepreneurial style, Brian chose an army duck to cross the sand spit linking Babel with Flinders Island. This allowed easy and economic access, rather than chartering the small ships which had traditionally serviced the birders on Babel for over 100 years. Bill Barrett had traded there in 1950 as mate in the Lowatta.
Now there was a lot of birding sheds on Babel, birding, and we used to have to take them out there. In the Lowatta we'd take it'd be one day you'd take them all out and put them ashore in the motorboat. They'd have their chooks and everything, and casts. There was always a battle over casts for mutton birds, you know. The salt, bags of salt would have to go out as well. It could have been about 20 sheds on Babel Island. Now, there was only one white family to bird on white, and that was Bill Holloway. He used to bird on Babel Island. And some days, East Beach and that, you mightn't be able to work there, see, because there's too much swell. Now, you do it with a motorboat. You bring the motorboat in and drop your anchor and hold your boat out, and then you had the skids that used to go in the stern of the motorboat, and they'd go on the shore, like go out, the skids would go out like that, and you roll the barrels up onto the skids, onto the motorboat, into the motorboat, you see.
In 1979, Brian Stackhouse decided to leave the islands and buy a farm in Victoria. This meant dissolving his partnership with brother Alf, though he retained the lease of Hogan Island. Alf gained a degree of independence from the shipping companies in the early 80s when he bought the Alcheringa. This 50-foot vessel, designed on traditional fishing boat lines, was built on a farm at Ringarooma by Aidan France.
Aidan had, on this occasion, was using it connected with the mutton bird industry at Dog Island, and he had it anchored offshore, and she's 50 feet, so you can't just anchor them anywhere. And during the middle of the night, I came up a southwest gale in April, I think it was, and in the mutton bird season, and blew her ashore onto the rocks, unfortunately. And of course the waves that were associated with that gale of wind bashed her on the rocks and knocked holes in her and damaged her severely. And we got to hear about it and went and had a look at her and decided that Aidan didn't have the capacity to save her, so we offered him a price.
Alf subsequently had her repaired and put to work.
I've carted sheep to the island on Alcheringa. I would be able to put 200 on deck, but I've had 160 on, representing a equal share of the flock to be moved. And I've carted them from Whitemark or Lady Baron to here. They handle that all right as long as it's fine weather. And we put the ship alongside one of the jetties and run the sheep off down a raceway. That's very successful, but I wouldn't like to take a load on Alcheringa on a long journey like to Launceston, because they'd get tired and lie down, because the small boat moves quite a lot, whereas the bigger boat doesn't. And but it's handy to get them on from a short distance. But I take the wool, and the biggest load we've had on was 48 bales, which we took to Bridport. We have 14 below decks in a hold and the balance on deck, and cover it up with a tarpaulin, and that's quite successful. I've been doing that for 20 years probably by now, because the boats that are now on the Flinders Trade are really too big to come and use the jetty that's here. That's all, they're just too big.
Alcheringa has doubled as a pleasure boat for Alf and his family, having cruised to Queensland and circumnavigated Tasmania. In recent years, with the help of some friends, he has sailed into the biannual Australian Wooden Boat Festival in Hobart, one of the few honest working girls amongst the glitz and glamour of the mainly recreational craft.
enjoy looking at other people's boats, and I guess they enjoy looking at other people's boats too. Hence they've got this one to look at along with all the other 500 others.
In 1995, the Tasmanian government transferred the ownership of Badger Island to the Aboriginal Land Council. However, the existing lease arrangements with ALF were allowed to continue. In 1995, a new barge service was introduced to the islands. This took business away from the Lady Gillian, which was wholly owned by the islanders. She was withdrawn from service and sold. With bullocks to be removed from Hogan Island, Brian decided to build his own barge, which has turned out to be a larger task than envisaged. At the time of completing this film, and 2 years after our first filming, it was still a work in progress. Alf has had another 2 shearings on Badger Island since our first filming and is still thinking of giving it up.
It was all go. There was plenty of activity.
Always thought there was a lot to learn from some of those old hands. The old hands that were there, and took that on board, and yeah, found it was something that was, I never found it hard to go to work when I worked there. That was something, I really enjoyed. So, and we had a lot of fun in those days. I'm still going to sea on the supply boats and the rigs, but our conditions are a lot better. But I always say that in those days we worked a damn lot harder and we had a lot more fun. So.
No, I think you accept waiting. You're more patient. If it doesn't happen today, well, it'll happen tomorrow or next week. Why worry?
I regret leaving Prime Steel, but things have to move on and everything, but it was a very interesting part of my life and I don't regret 1 minute of it.
In a jocular form, we all have to die sometime. If I'd like to be doing my work here that I've done all the time and be walking back to the house to get a cup of tea or something and fall over dead. That'd be the ideal way to go on Badger Island.